The palace at Madrid in the early 19th century was no stranger to whispers of intrigue, betrayal, and unspeakable tragedy. But in the autumn of 1833, as King Ferdinand VII of Spain lay dying, those whispers took on a more sinister weight. His final days were not noble, nor peaceful, nor shrouded in the dignity one might expect for a monarch. Instead, they veered into the grotesque, the nightmarish, and the almost unbelievable tale of a king who seemed to rot alive before the horrified eyes of his court. From birth, Ferdinand had been marked with the heavy inheritance of centuries of dynastic inbreeding. The Spanish Bourbons, like their Habsburg predecessors, had twisted family trees where cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and bloodlines tangled until nature itself seemed to retaliate. Physical frailties, mental instability, and grotesque medical conditions flowed as surely through the crown as did riches and power. Ferdinand, born in 1784, embodied all of these flaws, but nowhere were they more evident than in his later years. For the people of Spain, Ferdinand was already infamous before illness consumed him. Called the Desired, when he wrested the throne back from Napoleon's puppet rulers, he quickly squandered his aura of heroism with cruelty, paranoia, and reactionary politics. The Inquisition, dissolved by modern minds in Europe, was reawakened at his bidding. Ideas of equality and liberty, so dangerously contagious after the French Revolution, were ruthlessly stamped out. Dissidents who dared whisper freedom often found themselves in prisons so dark and humid that their punishment was indistinguishable from slow execution. Spain, while the rest of Europe staggered into modernity, was dragged backward by a man whose gaze was fixed on absolutism and the divine right to rule. Yet the reign of Ferdinand was not just a political tyranny, but one steeped in personal grotesquerie. The king's health, always fragile, began to betray him in visible ways by the 1820s. He was obese, his skin pocked and clammy, and he often moved with a stiffness that suggested his own body was rebelling. His digestion failed him so frequently that servants whispered of foul stenches that lingered in his chambers more noticeably than incense or royal perfumes. His teeth were yellowed, many rotting straight from their sockets. There were rumours of ulcers, skin infections, and sores that healed poorly if at all. Still, when you are king, courtiers smile, bow, and pretend not to see. But with Ferdinand, the pretense grew impossible. By 1832, his decline accelerated in ways that could not be hidden. The king developed a condition modern medicine might call gangrenous necrosis, where flesh does not simply wither, but begins to die while one still lives. His legs, swollen and mottled, turned from bruised purple to black in patches. The stench became overpowering. Visitors to his court described the odour of decay clinging to his chambers, as if death itself was a resident there. Physicians applied ointments, poultices, leeches, and aromatic herbs. Priests sprinkled holy water and performed blessings. But none of it stemmed the inexorable progress of disease. Imagine a monarch presiding over his realm, while the lower halves of his legs literally rotted. Skin sloughed away from muscle, muscle peeled from bone. The king's attendants, staggered by loyalty and horror, were tasked daily with washing wounds that could never heal. Reports described insects buzzing near his sheets, feasting on what the physicians could not cut away fast enough. The air was heavy with putrefaction. It was said that entering his chambers was to step into a tomb before its doors had been sealed. Despite the physical wreck of his body, Ferdinand clung fiercely to his throne. He was not a monarch resigned to fading quietly. Rather, even in decay, his paranoia roared louder than ever. His suspicious mind convinced him conspirators lurked behind shadows of every tapestry, whispering not just about his rotten flesh, but about his fragile dynasty. His greatest fear was the succession. For years he had failed to produce a viable heir. 3 wives had passed, leaving no surviving children. Then, late in his reign, his 4th queen and niece, Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, presented him with a daughter, the future Isabella II. For Ferdinand, this child was the lifeline to preserve his Bourbon line. For his enemies, particularly his reactionary brother Don Carlos, the daughter was a problem. A boy could inherit without question, but a girl was a dangerous proposition, especially in a kingdom bursting with royalists eager for a reactionary male. As Ferdinand's flesh withered in the heat of disease, intrigues over succession flared hotter around him. Don Carlos and his supporters whispered that Ferdinand's rotting curse was evidence of divine judgment, a sign his bloodline should not continue. They argued that Spain needed a strong man on the throne, one untainted by rot, and that the king's little daughter was a usurper, a pawn of liberal forces hiding behind the skirts of a queen regent. The young Isabella had barely learned to walk when she became the symbolic epicenter of a storm. Spain teetered on the cusp of civil war, yet its monarch lay crying out in agony at night as physicians carved decayed tissue from his body. Those final months were a theatre of both horror and absurdity. Ferdinand, too ill to rule effectively, nevertheless ordered reports from ministers, signing decrees with hands trembling not from weakness, but from the fever burning through him. He summoned his daughters to his chamber, stroking their hair with fingers already blackened by spreading necrosis. He argued with priests about which saints might intervene. He lashed out at physicians one day, bribed them with jewels the next. Everyone who entered his rooms faced the contradiction of a man convinced of his eternal right to rule, even as his body proclaimed more forcefully with each sunrise that nothing immortal clung to him. The court became accustomed to the daily rituals of rot, the scraping away of infected flesh, the shuffling of servants carrying away soiled linens too foul to launder, the sudden waves of nausea that overtook visitors unused to the suffocating odor. Attendants joked in whispers that the court had transformed into a hospital wing, except the patient wore a crown and insisted on dictating orders between screams of pain. One eyewitness recorded that by mid-1833, Ferdinand's feet had turned to nothing more than stumps hidden beneath royal stockings. He could not leave his bed unassisted, and when priests brought him the sacrament, they were forced to mask nausea with pious murmurs. Still, Ferdinand hoarded what remained of his authority with a miser's grip. He signed the Pragmatic Sanction, declaring once and for all that his daughter Isabella would inherit the throne over Don Carlos's claims. His decayed hand scrawled the decree, sealing with rot what court chroniclers knew would become a war of succession drenched in blood. And so, the stage was set. A king who stank of death still fought to bend history to his will. A kingdom simmered with rebellion, waiting for his final breath to break into war. And within his chambers, in the flickering lamplight, attendants whispered of watching their sovereign slowly consumed while his heart still beat. The bizarre case of a king who did not simply die, he rotted alive. The waning days of Ferdinand's life unfolded like a macabre ritual, a grotesque dance between medicine, faith, and decay. His physicians became stewards of a crumbling body, their work reduced to a daily struggle not for healing, but for delaying the inevitable. They applied poultices made of honey, vinegar, pitch, and aromatic herbs, hoping the strong smells would mask the reek of necrosis. Bandages soaked through with fluids were removed each morning only to reveal more skin fallen away overnight, patches of bone visible beneath deteriorating flesh. Flies circled around the king's bed, despite the strict attempts of servants to keep them away. No velvet curtains, no perfumed water, no gold-plated candelabra could disguise the unmistakable reality. Ferdinand was decomposing while still alive. The doctors of the court described the deterioration in hushed tones that would never make it into official reports. Gangrene spread relentlessly from his feet upward, latching onto his calves, thighs, and groin. Hands turned stiff and brittle, earning the king the whispered nickname among chambermaids as the Wooden Monarch. His face, bloated and puffy, carried a waxen sheen that unnerved even those used to the nearness of death. They said his skin was cold to the touch, yet he would burn with fever beneath it, as though two worlds, life and death, were waging a final battle inside his body. Religion, as always, shouldered its way into the center of his suffering. The king's chambers filled daily with priests carrying relics and sprinkling holy water across sheets stained with his own foulness. Some suggested that his condition was a punishment from God for sins of pride, cruelty, and lust. Others clung to the idea that his body's corruption was evidence of his sanctity being tested by demonic forces. Neither explanation eased his pain. By night he begged saints for intercession, his voice hoarse, gasping, sometimes barely audible above the buzzing of flies. By day, he accused treacherous courtiers of poisoning him, perhaps with powders hidden in wine or ointments slipped into his food. Maria Christina, his queen and niece, stood by with a grim sense of duty. To her, the rotting sovereign was not just a husband, but a crucial guardian of her daughter's inheritance. The Pragmatic Sanction Ferdinand had issued naming their infant Isabella as heir was fragile, its legitimacy strained by factions of nobles loyal to Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos. To protect the throne for her child, The queen needed the king alive just a little longer, long enough for the decree to become undeniable, long enough for his dying hand to leave behind legitimacy. She endured the stench, the cries, the horror of watching his flesh blacken and sag. She ordered priests and doctors to maintain the illusion of dignity, ensuring visitors found him dressed in silks, his bed covered in rich tapestry. Even if beneath those folds, his body was becoming little more than a decayed husk. Whispers outside the chamber grew darker and more dangerous. Don Carlos's supporters circulated rumors that the king's gangrene was divine confirmation of his unsuitability to rule. To them, Ferdinand was cursed, Spain suffering under his decay, just as his body suffered under rot. They argued that a king rotting before his subjects was proof that God desired a new line, one born of Carlos, healthy and strong, not a line cursed with weakness and rebellion. Around the palace and across Spain, people began to divide themselves into two camps: supporters of little Isabella, championed by her mother, and Carlists, desperate for her uncle to seize power. The king's very flesh had become political symbolism, his disease proof in the eyes of many that the monarchy's future hovered on the edge of collapse. Physicians, desperate to stave off the end, began more extreme interventions. Some attempted cauterization, pressing hot irons against rotted flesh to halt infection. Others tried amputations, slicing away decayed portions under the assumption that if enough ruined tissue were cut away, life could persist a little longer. None succeeded. Instead, the procedures added fresh agony to Ferdinand's already broken body. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the stench of decomposition, creating a suffocating miasma that hung over the palace like a curse. His screams echoed down the halls, unnerving even guards hardened by campaigns against revolutionaries. Witnesses later swore that when the doors to his room were opened, an oppressive wave of stench rolled outward so potent it could be smelled half a corridor away. By the summer of 1833, Ferdinand was bedridden, his skin mottled blue and black, his speech slurred, often incoherent. His attendants could no longer disguise the reality. They were nursing not a king who would recover, but a man being devoured alive, piece by piece, by the disease that coursed through him. He refused, however, to relinquish command. Each morning, sometimes shaking with fever, sometimes delirious, he scrawled shaky signatures upon decrees, clinging to power as tightly as his dying fingers could manage. Ministers who came to report affairs of the realm kept their audience brief. Unable to withstand the sight or smell of him, he accused them of betrayal anyway. Convinced all around him, plotted against his queen and their daughter. The court became fractured by fear. Servants whispered that cleansing his wounds was like dressing the dead. Guards muttered about omens, that Spain's decline was manifest in its king's body. Priests recorded visits in increasingly anxious tones, torn between duty to a crown appointed by God and the obvious symbolism of royal flesh collapsing into putrefaction. Meanwhile, common Spaniards outside the palace walls were told little. Rumors reached them through markets and taverns. Some believed their king had already died and that a corpse was being propped up to issue decrees. Others thought him possessed, and in corners of villages and cities, superstitions flourished, that the earth itself was rejecting him, that Spain rotted because her king did. As his body weakened, his paranoia sharpened. He ordered guards doubled around his daughters. Certain enemies would attempt kidnapping to prevent Isabella's succession. He demanded that meals be tasted 3 times before reaching his lips, accusing cooks of conspiring with foreign powers. He even accused his own queen of plotting against him, though he would retract accusations when the fever ebbed and desperation returned. On some days, he demanded that the tombs of ancestors be opened. Certain dark secrets lay buried within them. On others, he begged silently that he might live one day longer, long enough to see Isabella seated firmly as sovereign of Spain. In the stillness of night, his attendants sometimes swore they heard the sound of fluids shifting beneath his skin, as though decay itself had infused his body. Open sores oozed with dark liquids, drawing thick cloths drenched every few hours. Disgust did not free them from their tasks, for refusing could mean dismissal, punishment, or worse. They worked with mechanical expressions, cleaning wounds that only grew larger, dressing him in royal garments so that rot and silk sat together in improbable union. It was during these late nights that courtiers and guards, gathered nervously in chambers just beyond his, began to prepare for what would come after his final breath. They knew the moment Ferdinand's heart ceased, Spain would be in the throes of conflict. Don Carlos would not sit idle. Already he had supporters arming themselves across the northern provinces, prepared to contest Isabella's inheritance. Ferdinand's last decrees, signed with hands more claw than flesh, were meant to protect her crown, yet everyone feared they might unleash war. The sense of dread was magnified by the eerie spectacle of Ferdinand existing half alive, half dead. Ministers described him as a monarch whose body was already in the grave, but whose spirit clung to life with the desperation of a man whose crown was slipping away. And each day, when the blackened foot of the king seemed less human than yesterday, they prayed quietly that the end might come quickly. Sparing Spain further humiliation, autumn came, leaves began to fall across Madrid's avenues, and Ferdinand's body seemed almost to mirror the season, his flesh falling away as surely as dying leaves from trees. But the king endured, watching, gasping, issuing decrees from behind a veil of agony, as if unwilling to depart until Spain itself had been dragged to the brink of chaos with him. By late September of 1833, the terrible ordeal had reached its final stage. Ferdinand lay immobile within his chamber, his body hardly recognizable as once royal. His legs were swollen to grotesque proportions, yet blackened and brittle where gangrene had eaten deep into tissue. His skin had taken on the yellow-grey pallor of a man already embalmed, though his chest still rose in shallow, rasping gulps for air. The smell was now inescapable. Courtiers rotated shifts not out of honor but survival, unable to withstand prolonged exposure without falling sick themselves. Even incense burned in great bowls could do nothing to mask the odor of dissolving flesh. The palace was suffocating under the weight of one man's decay, and yet he clung to life with a stubbornness that unnerved everyone. It was said that Ferdinand's voice by then carried only in broken whispers. Each sentence came like an echo out of his hollowing body, a king's command shrunken to the frail rasp of a dying man. He demanded that Isabella's name be honored above all others. In moments of lucidity, he ordered papers signed, reasserting her right to reign, while Maria Cristina supervised every detail. In moments of fever, he cursed her, accused her of plotting against him, and swore Don Carlos's shadow crept into his rooms. His mind, weakened and consumed by pain, no longer separated friend from foe. Those who loved him endured slander. Those who despised him grew emboldened, knowing his throne was being pried loose by death itself. The daily rituals of rotting continued, though they scarcely mattered at that point. Doctors lanced abscesses, drained fluids, and bound limbs so fragile that bandaging often caused more damage than healing. They wiped the black ooze that seeped continuously from sores on his legs and torso, but the fluids returned by evening. Bones pressed against thinning skin like jagged stones pushing beneath a rotted canvas. Ferdinand's chest heaved against lungs rattling with infection. Some believed pneumonia hastened by his weakened state would finish him before necrosis consumed him entirely. Even in bed, he smelled like the inside of a crypt, a horror for anyone who dared draw too near. Outside the palace, Spain waited with tension stretched to breaking point. Don Carlos, though not yet proclaimed, counted allies across the conservative factions eager for him to reign as Carlos V. Isabella was barely 3 years old, too young to defend herself, her future entrusted entirely to Maria Cristina and the fragile authority of decrees signed by a dying hand. The people of Madrid gazed at the palace windows, wondering whether the corpse of their monarch still lived, and in taverns, prayers mingled with mutiny. The air grew heavy with expectation of war. On September 29th, the long struggle ended. Attendants later swore Ferdinand's final conscious moments were a muddled mixture of rage and despair. With his family gathered close, he muttered unintelligible prayers, clutching at bedclothes as though grasping for life itself. His body twitched with spasms of fever until at last his chest fell still. The king's rot had finally spread farther than flesh. Death claimed the man who had clung to his crown, even as his very body betrayed him. The room fell silent, except for the long sighs of attendants who had waited so long for this release. Yet relief was not the same as peace. Mere hours after Ferdinand's last breath, Madrid seethed with rumour. Had God finally punished the tyrant? Was Isabella the rightful queen? Or was Spain destined for Carlos, strong and unspoiled by the deformities of his brother? The body of the king presented a problem. Preservation of royal dignity required embalming, but Ferdinand had spoiled long before he died. His corpse was too fragile, bones loosened from sinew, organs already liquefying. Attempts to prepare him for public display met disaster. Surgeons struggled against tissue so soft it tore beneath their hands. The smell became overpowering, forcing attendants to retreat repeatedly from their work. Still, tradition demanded a procession. Dressed in rich attire, the body was shown more statue than man, painted with powders and oils to hide its putrefaction. Those who bowed before him whispered prayers not to their sovereign, but to avoid the sickness of their stomachs. His body, it seemed, mocked the dignity his reign had never achieved. In death, Ferdinand's ambition was fulfilled for only a fleeting moment. Isabella was proclaimed queen, her mother serving as regent. Yet the king's flesh had been only the first battlefield. Within days, Don Carlos declared himself rightful heir. The Carlist Wars erupted across Spain, plunging the kingdom into a civil conflict that drew blood for decades. His rot became metaphor for where his body had decayed in life. Now his country fractured in war. Those who had served him in the palace spoke of the uncanny image of a monarch half corpse, half man, forcing his will upon a kingdom even as worms seemed ready to claim him. Some remembered with pity, others with horror, but all agreed no king had ever demonstrated so vividly the grotesque fragility of human power. Ferdinand ruled through fear, cruelty, and suspicion, yet he ended like a common man, eaten from within, reeking, pitiful, and desperate. And so Spain remembered him, not as the heroic, desired prince who once returned from Napoleonic captivity, but as the rotting king trapped between life and death for weeks on end, clinging to a throne while his body dissolved beneath him. His reign, like his body, collapsed into filth, leaving only ruin, division, and war in its wake. In many ways, Ferdinand VII became less a man than a symbol, a monarch whose flesh wrote the truest story of his reign. A kingdom that once spanned oceans shrank into disrepair and bloodshed, just as the man who had ruled it shrank into decay. Thus ended the bizarre case of Spain's king who rotted alive, a man whose final days blurred the line between legend and nightmare, leaving behind the stench not only of his body, but of an entire reign eaten away from within.